Back. A gifted teenager is on track to graduation with honors. Yes, he is doing very well in all of his classes. But unfortunately, after some time passes, his best friend in all of the world passes away, his grandfather. And from that point on, this talented teenager finds it difficult to concentrate on his studies. His grades begin to slip, and on various occasions, he can be seen thinking about and pondering over his loss. Well, what happened to the young man? How could we sum his situation up in one word? That word we would use is trauma. Now, trauma has been defined as an emotional response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event. Trauma is divided into three main types: acute, chronic, and complex. So now I know you're looking at the title of the video and you're saying, what does conflict have to do with trauma? Well, let's examine what trauma actually is, and then we'll find the connection there, okay? So the very first kind of trauma or type is acute trauma. And acute trauma is extreme enough to threaten a person's emotional and physical security. And it's so threatening that it leaves a lasting impression on the individual's mind. And if not treated by medical professionals, it could lead to difficulties later on in life. So now, what are some of the causes, or some of the symptoms, I should say, of acute trauma? Excessive anxiety or pain, irritation, confusion, inability to have a restful sleep, feeling of disconnection from the surroundings, unreasonable lack of trust, inability to focus on work or studies, lack of self-care or grooming, aggressive behavior. Now, does that young man have any of those symptoms? Absolutely. But now let's go on to the next one, chronic trauma. Now remember that acute trauma is a single traumatizing event. It's one event that has such a profound impact on the person's mind that if a person doesn't seek help, it could have drastic effects on the rest of his or her life. So what is chronic trauma? Now, chronic trauma is when an individual is exposed to multiple long-term or prolonged events that cause distress to that particular person. Yes, that distress comes in the form of traumatic events. So now, what are some of these long-term traumatic events that could cause chronic trauma? I'll give you some examples. Long-term physical illness, maybe like cancer, sexual abuse, domestic violence, bullying, and exposure to extreme situations. All of those long-term circumstances can cause chronic trauma. What about the third one? Complex trauma. Well, just like chronic trauma, it's the result of exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences. But now the difference between chronic trauma and complex trauma is that complex trauma takes into account interpersonal interactions. That means interaction between two people. That's the difference. And this kind of trauma causes a person to feel trapped. Like there's no way to get out of the situation that they're currently in. It has a severe impact on the person's mind. And then it goes on to mention here in this research that it can affect a person's overall health, relationships, and performance at work and school. So now, how does complex trauma play out? What are some examples? Well, an individual could be a victim of child abuse. He could be a victim of neglect, domestic violence. He could witness family disputes or other traumatic, repetitive situations. But now remember, complex trauma focuses on interpersonal interaction. So now we're getting to the meat of it, because interpersonal interactions, especially at work and at school or in the family, give rise to conflict. The longer you're around an individual, the more you become relaxed, the more they become relaxed, Sometimes you're given to have conflict, right? So now, one of the articles that I appreciated on the matter of conflict resolution is the top 5 strategies to resolve interpersonal conflict in the workplace. And even though right now we are focused on the business side, the workplace side, these aspects of conflict resolution can be used in any situation that you find yourself in. So now let's take a look at it. When you talk about, as we mentioned, interpersonal interaction, because a person has a different perception of his interests, his needs, and his wants, sometimes those 3 things, your wants and your needs, as well as your values, they clash with another individual. On certain subjects, you all may not be able to agree, which causes conflict. So now the conflict can be resolved with a hostile exchange between the two, or individuals can let cooler heads prevail and simply talk the situation out. So what makes the difference between a heated and hostile debate or a heated and hostile encounter and one where an individual can calmly sit down and reason with another person to achieve peace? Well, one thing we have to realize about interpersonal conflict, especially in the workplace, is that competition can sometimes be very positive. Competition is what drives an individual to be better, to perform better, to look at his level of work ethic, and that competition causes him to push that level up. So, as we mentioned, competition can be positive, but also competition can be negative, especially when an individual is putting forth the greatest amount of effort that they can muster, and seemingly they're being looked over. So that could cause conflict. He's competing, he's putting forth his best effort, and yet it appears that his best effort is not good enough. So now, what can we do then? What are these steps that we would recommend to resolve conflict? Because remember now, conflict, especially interpersonal conflict, can cause complex trauma. And complex trauma can cause conflict. So it's circular. And in order to prevent one or the other from happening, we need to see how it is that we can prevent conflicts from escalating to a point where they become hostile. So now the first thing that we can do to calm the situation down is choose the right place and the time to have a conversation with an individual that you may be at odds with. So what you will want to do, instead of approaching this person in front of everyone in the office, or approaching a person in front of all of the family members, you would want to choose a situation and a location that would be private. And then you would express your opinions, your thoughts, your concerns to that individual, your intentions in a conversation in a respectful and a peaceful tone. Because as we remember now, we're trying to prevent conflict, because conflict leads to trauma. So that's one way that we could do it. Being wise about the right time and the place to approach the situation in a peaceful fashion so that you all can have a conversation. And then 2 plays right into what we said in part 1. Be polite, be professional, and be respectful. Because the purpose of the conversation is to reach a peaceful resolution, especially when you're working with an individual. You want to collaborate with that individual from time to time. You may be put on teams with him or her. And so it's necessary to have peaceful interactions so that you can be more productive. There can be no productivity when individuals are at odds because they can't work together. So having peaceful relations between individuals that you may go to work with, it will allow you to be more productive in the long run. So as we mentioned, number 2, be polite, professional, and be respectful. So your goal again is to assure that person that your intention is to find a solution to the difficulty that you all have and to rebuild any trust that has been lost. Okay? What about the third point? It says listen carefully and acknowledge how the other person may feel. Now, I know that in a heated situation, it's our tendency to push our thoughts and our feelings to the front of the conversation. But in this case, as number 3 mentions, we need to listen and then acknowledge how that other individual feels. So this would involve active listening. We're not listening to the person so that we can cut them off and tell them about themselves and about their actions and about what we don't appreciate. No, you're active listening so that you can find common ground to approach the person to reach a peaceful resolution. And one thing that we can do is we can reassure that individual that even though this is an awkward situation, the situation is necessary because, as we mentioned, we're trying to reach a resolution where everybody can work together. What about the fourth point? That's important too. It says try and understand the conflict from the other person's point of view. So anytime you're looking at a situation from another person's point of view, then you are employing the quality of empathy. You're putting yourself in that person's shoes. And in so doing, you maybe can see their point of view a little bit better because you're taking into consideration all of the factors that make this person behave the way that they do. Why did this person come at this situation in the way that they did? If you take on their point of view, you'll be better able to understand that. It goes on to say, too, it helps you get past your own perspective and, as we mentioned, develop empathy. It also mentions that we don't all have the same experiences in life. We haven't all gone through the same thing, so we need to take just a moment to consider the other side of the conflict. And in doing that, see, we arm ourselves with the ability to reach a resolution faster. Now, what about the fifth one? Now, the fifth one may be difficult, especially if you've lost your composure in this situation, but we'll go into it nevertheless. The fifth one is nipping in the bud early. Because, once again now, conflict, if left to fester, is only going to give rise to more and more negative feelings, and before you know it, there's quite a bit of animosity and resentment that has built up as a result of not going in and handling the conflict the way that we should have. And so, as we mentioned, it escalates. And so, resentment, anger, frustration can grow to the point where it is out of control. And when it gets to that point, then conflict turns into aggression, and then sometimes aggression escalates into violence. So you see why it's so important to be aware of how to diffuse a situation, how to resolve a conflict before it escalates to a point where individuals may put their freedom, their job, their livelihood in jeopardy. It's necessary to be able to reach a peaceful resolution with an individual before that individual resorts to violence or before they have to catch some hands. So now, in summary, what have we learned? We've learned, first of all, that there are 3 kinds of trauma. There's acute, there's chronic, there's complex. Acute being a single instance that causes an individual to fear for their emotional or their physical well-being. And that event is so traumatic that it leaves an impression on the person's mind, and if they don't get help, then it can have disastrous consequences in the future. And then we go to chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is over a long period of time. And within that long period of time, there are multiple instances of events that put that person's physical and emotional well-being at stake. And this too leaves a great indelible impression on the individual's mind. And once again, that person would need to seek help. But now the one that we're most concerned with, chronic trauma, involves interpersonal interaction. That means interaction between 2 people. And so in the family, at school, at work, in these situations, there is an abundance of interpersonal interaction. And so because your values, your perspective, your interests may be different, in that context, you may clash with another individual. And when you clash, conflict arises. But as we mentioned, those 5 wonderful ways that we can resolve conflict, we'll go over them again. The first one is to choose the right place and time to have a conversation. So you want to do it in the open. You choose a time that's desirable for the person as well as a private setting. Number 2, be polite, professional, and respectful. And you can do that because your goal is to have a collaborative resolution with this individual, a resolution that brings about peace between you and them so that you all can continue to work together. Then 3, listen carefully and acknowledge how the other person feels. And as we mentioned, that involves active listening, because your goal in listening to this individual is trying to piece together why that individual reacts the way that they do in certain situations and how it is that you can come to a peaceful resolution with that individual. Then the 4th one is to try and understand the conflict from the other person's point of view. And as we mentioned, this will call on you and I to use the quality of empathy so that we can place ourselves in that person's shoes and perhaps see their perspective. Maybe there's something that's going on with them that if we look from their perspective, we can see why it is that the conflict may have arisen. And then the 5th one, nip it in the bud early. So we don't want to let that conflict fester. We don't want to let it turn into resentment and anger. Because if we leave it too long, then resentment and anger can turn into aggression, and aggression can turn into violence. And as we mentioned, when things become violent, then the person jeopardizes his way of life, the way that he takes care of his family, and in some cases, even his freedom. So it's necessary that conflict resolution is something that we look at. It's invaluable in the business world because many times we will meet individuals who do not see things the way that we do. Should we be offended? Well, if we are concentrating on resolving conflicts before they become too much to handle, then those things will not prevent us from working along with those individuals and being productive. We'd like to thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Be easy.